Today we're going to take a look at Chapter 26.2, The Origins of the Cold War and Containment in Europe. The first big issue that we're going to take a look at is the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviets from the time of World War II to 1945. Now, part of the problem was from the very get-go, the United States was very leery of Stalin, prominently because of the non-aggression pact he had signed with Hitler where they split Poland. And again, Stalin was actually remaining out of the war. However, what changed, of course, is when Hitler backstabs Stalin and violates the non-aggression pact. So essentially, we ally with the Soviet Union, that is the U.S., not because we see them as a potential ally, but it's one of convenience. We didn't really trust the Soviets. So really, our relationship was shaky from the get-go. Now, once the war was over, we have some positive and some negative in working with the Soviets. One of the positive ones was they helped create the United Nations. The second, which was a negative, was the Soviets actually rejected Bernard Barac's plan, you can see him pictured here on the right, which called for the elimination of all atomic weapons and atomic power. Had this been agreed to, this would have been the downplay of atomic weapons, and the arms race never would have actually started. So by them not signing or agreeing to this, this led to the further development of more deadly atomic weaponry. Now, another negative is the Soviets rejected participation in the UN's World Bank. The UN's World Bank was set up to help to restore Europe and help countries that had been devastated by the war. The Soviets responded saying that banks were instruments of capitalism and designed to control essentially global domination. So they rejected this policy. On the positive side, you can see that the Soviets took participation in the Nuremberg trials where they looked at Soviet war criminals. And you can see these are some of the esteemed judges from all the nations. The Soviet Union's judges are on the far left. Now, one of the big ones which really ticked Truman off was the creation of satellite nations. Stalin had violated the Yalta Agreement, or technically he found a loophole in it. It said that free elections had to be held in all of the occupied territory that was taken over by Germany. Well, you can see here our light red or pink color. Essentially what happened was Stalin had one individual run. So everybody was free to elect the one individual of that country, or they didn't elect anybody. So again, this was really a loophole and not what was meant by free elections. The other issue is going to be German occupation. The Germans and the United States end up dividing the country, and in my time I grew up with a West Germany, which is located here in the blue, and an East Germany, which is located in the red. Now, if you'll notice the little yellow spot on the map, that is actually Berlin. Berlin is further going to be subdivided. You have the eastern side of Berlin will be Soviet controlled, and the western side will actually be divided up into England, France, and the United States zones of occupation. The real kind of big blow that surmised everything is Winston Churchill was speaking in Missouri, and you guys might be able to notice there Harry S. Truman is seated next to him on the left. Churchill gave a speech referencing that the satellite nations essentially represented an iron curtain that surrounded Eastern Europe and actually prevented capitalism and free elections and all of the things that we associate with being a good ideological and political system coming through. So this will switch to the policy of containment. Now, containment essentially means that the U.S. and its allies didn't believe that communism could be destroyed, not without having World War III start. So the idea was to prevent its spread, and literally contain it where it was located and don't let it go anywhere else. Truman used three people in particular to help him with this: Secretary of State General George Marshall, who we'll look at in a little bit with his Marshall Plan, Under Secretary of State Dean Axon, and finally George F. Kennan, who was an expert on Soviet affairs, which you can see pictured on the right. I believe this was a portrait used for Time Life magazine on his ideas and ideology of how to deal with the Soviets. The Truman Doctrine, essentially what it did, it put into practice the containment policy. And again, the idea, it started with the Soviets trying to take over Greece by infiltration, and in Turkey they were trying to push for a water route into the Mediterranean. So Truman's policy was essentially support these countries financially by giving them money, weaponry, anything that they could do to essentially block communism, keep it out of the area. And it was successful. As a result of this, Western Europe did not have any major communist infiltration, with the exception of some spies. Now, General George Marshall came up with the concept essentially of looking at history and figuring out what to do. When you look at history in World War I, the problem was the depression, and the money that the Germans were forced to pay allowed the rise of demagogue dictators. So Marshall's plan was, instead of forcing and hurting the West, rebuild them. If you rebuild them, you give them a capitalist ideology, and they in turn will embrace capitalism, and communism will seem more like a threat. And this plan worked beautifully with the Truman Doctrine's policy of containment and the implication of Marshall's plan, kind of injecting millions and millions of dollars into it. We end up having Germany will eventually, or at least at the time, West Germany was one of our biggest allies in support of anti-communist policy. Now, Stalin tried to prevent the U.S. and the Allied forces from accessing Berlin. So they blockaded all land routes, and essentially what happened was Truman responded with what became known as the Berlin Airlift. And you can see in this cartoon caricature, you have Truman flying planes over 24/7 landing in Berlin, and Stalin, of course, on the ground just being angry. Essentially what happened was, and a lot of people believe that this may have actually caused World War III, but the tension never rose high enough. And finally, after 11 months, Stalin figured there's no point pushing the issue, and he lifted the blockade, allowing deliveries to be made to Berlin. And this was really critical because West Berlin was literally cut off of all supplies: water, food, toilet paper, you name it. The Berlin people in the West were really having a hard time. Now, the other policy that ends up coming up is the creation of what became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's going to form in 1949, and essentially the concept is if communism threatened any member whatsoever, this would cause an immediate retaliation from all of the Allied forces. So it's kind of ironic in a sense, because what this was the whole collective security argument of the League of Nations. But now, because of the nuclear threat, it became much more instantaneous in need of response. The Soviets will eventually respond with the same identical concept in 1955 called the Warsaw Pact. So if any of the capitalists interfered in any satellite nations, the same result would actually occur. We finally get the National Security Act, which is going to do a number of different things. One, it's going to create the Department of Defense, which will actually coordinate all branches of the military and organize them into specific Cold War policy. We also will have the National Security Council will be created, and this will direct all Cold War policy for the United States and in arrangement with our allies. And finally, we have the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, our spy network, which will start to infiltrate Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, trying to gain any information about Soviet aggression or expansion. Now, the biggest thing which is really going to cause the arms race to come underway is the Soviets had stolen the plans by using a Canadian spy ring, and with the help of the Rosenbergs, who were connected to the Manhattan Project, and they will detonate their first atomic weapon in 1949. This causes a massive gut reaction from the United States. 20% increase in military spending is authorized, and we get the creation of the hydrogen bomb in the early 50s, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And then it expands later to ICBMs and eventually MIRVs, which are multiple interstellar reentry vehicles.